John D. Anderson. You need the D if you have a name like John Anderson. I was born in 1926 on the day before Christmas in New Haven, Connecticut. My father, New Haven, of course, is where Yale is and practically nothing else. My father was a research chemist, a biochemist who worked in human nutrition. My mother, who worked all her life as well, was a sociologist, and she was the first female graduate of the new school of social work at the University of Columbia. I went through the 5th grade in Connecticut, and then this was during the Depression, and the department my father was, the very small department my father was involved in, was shut down by the university. Universities were hit just like everybody else. So he found work in Philadelphia, and we lived there for about a year. It was there that I first showed any interest, I guess, in architecture and planning. I carved an entire city out of ivory soap. Philadelphia was a totally different experience from New Haven, and I was really fascinated and overwhelmed by the city. But down in the basement of the house we lived in, I laid out a city on butcher paper, and then proceeded to do three-dimensional buildings of my vision of a city. Before graduation, I enlisted in the Naval Air Corps training program, and they sent me for the first year to Trinity College, 20 miles away from home. Join the Navy, see the world. And one of my instructors was an out-of-work architect. I'd never had any encounter with architects before. Wonderful guy, taught a course in descriptive geometry. And I learned later that he was one of the better-known architects in Hartford. But at this time, I just, I would have conversations with him after class and finding out what architecture was all about. By that time, I was fascinated enough by architecture so that I decided I really wanted to study architecture and be an architect. I applied to 4 schools when I got out of the service: Harvard, Yale, MIT, and RPI. And the only one that gave me a tumble, believe it or not, was Harvard. And I've never been so fortunate in my life. But the other schools were good, but Harvard was quite something. Gropius was the chair of the Department of Architecture within the School of Design. I went to Harvard, finished my undergraduate work in 2.5 years, stayed on for another 2.5 at the Graduate School of Design. So I was at Harvard for 5 years. I was really awed by the quality of the leadership in the school, the teaching. My favorite instructor, for instance, was Hugh Stubbins. There were a great many of the faculty were members of Gropius's architectural firm, which was the Architects Collaborative. Just a wonderful group of people. The important thing, I think, about the GSD was that every instructor, with one sole exception, an older guy, was a practicing architect. It was not these were not academics. And Gropius put this together very deliberately. It was a very unique, very wonderful experience. Very close relationships between instructors and students. They spend a lot of time with us, but as I say, they were all practitioners, and I think they did much to orient the students on what practice was all about. Theory was a word I never heard in the entire time I was in the graduate school. There was no such thing to Gropius as architectural theory. It was practice and architectural education. Those were the two the two roots that meant anything in terms of architecture. It was a fantastic experience, and I'm still awed by the fact that blind luck got me into Harvard. It wasn't blind luck, I got accepted, but wow, to think that 3 schools would overlook me, and the 4th, which at that time certainly was head and shoulders above the others. My roommate and Floaty's roommate in college, she went to Wellesley, were dating and introduced us. We got married a year before they did. She was a math major, believe it or not, and really, well, you know her, she's a bright lady. And you ought to interview her for her career as well in transportation policy planning. But she had a degree when she finished in 1950 in an AB in math, and but by the time she got out of college, she was also thinking in terms of social issues and much more than just science and math. And I think that's a mix that has certainly driven her career. I remember, with 6 months yet to go, asking Hugh Stubbins what criteria he would suggest for deciding where to go to practice good contemporary architecture design. And Hugh was a Texan. And he said, well, the first thing I'd do is I'd find some place where you could live a full 12 years out of the year, 12 months out of the year, instead of hibernating for 6 and trying to squeeze the whole year into what's left. And I would go someplace where you could bring up a family. Most of the guys, we did not, but most of the guys and their wives had kids. And then secondly, I would find a new place, a place that hasn't really become well known, a place that has the potential for growth. It just hasn't taken off yet. And so that night I went home and Floaty and I sat down in front of a map. Within half an hour, we said, let's go to Denver. 6 months later, we threw everything we had in the car, and without a job, without ever having seen Denver. 5 days later, in March of 1952, we rolled into Denver. Within a week, we had a place to live, and I had a job, and we've never looked back, and it was the best decision we ever made. It became evident pretty quickly that Denver's architectural scene was an old boys club and a very tight-knit group of people who chose who would enter the club. It became very evident early on when I was looking for a job that there were people that you should try to work for and others you ought to stay away from. And that was a result of there being a standing suit at that time when I moved to Denver. Jim Johnson was suing the state for not allowing him to have a license by reciprocity. Jim was one of those people that I was told not to work for. But with a pregnant wife and a job that, as I recall, was paying $1.75 an hour with John Monroe, I really needed a few more dollars, and I worked for Jim nights and weekends. And it was a great experience because the guy I was working for, Jack Monroe, was really the successor for Jack Benedict, who everybody knows about as one of Denver's premier architects. And I learned a lot. I just bit my lip because there was Jack, when he hired me, said, we do a little modified contemporary around here. It's quite heavily modified. And I didn't know what that meant, but I found out later. I worked for him, I like to say, for 104 weeks. I got out of there before 2 years was over, and was hired by Wheeler and Lewis. I had wanted to work for them when I first came to town. I found them just the kind of guys that I thought I would like to work with. They just didn't have enough work. So 102 weeks after I went to work for Jack Monroe, I got a call from Carol Lewis, and he said, "Can you join us? We've got too much work." And I gave 2 weeks' notice and moved to Wheeler and Lewis, where I spent the next 6.5 years before starting my own practice in 1960. With Wheeler and Lewis, who did almost exclusively schools, I learned a lot about school design, and that's been a fascination and a love of mine through my entire career. Schools, I think, are probably the most important thing we can do and do well. And I began to develop a decent portfolio. Finally got a job for Jefferson County. By that time, I'd hired a guy, and Don Barker and Ron Rinker were two of my first employees. They, of course, later went on, put together Barker, Rinker, Seacat. And Russ Seacat joined the firm later. So it went through some iterations of, John Anderson Associates. Anderson, Barker, Rinker was the first real partnership. And that became the ABR Partnership and until 1975. So the first 15 years were just a matter of getting going, and there were some lean times. We had an awful lot of lamb patties, if I remember correctly. The ABR Partnership, as I say, and within 15 years we were getting college and university work. We were involved in a joint venture as Anderson, Barker, Rinker in the development of the master plan for the Auraria Higher Education Center. We had been hired as a firm by Metropolitan State to do their part of this joint campus, 170-acre campus that sat out here. We resigned from that team partway into the process. It was very obvious that the guy that the state had hired to coordinate the process really wanted to design this by himself. And we felt that there just wasn't a comfortable place for us on the design team, so we dropped out. Then we were given as kind of a booby prize the design of a new campus for the Community College of Denver, the North Campus, which has since become Front Range Community College. That took place in the 70s, in the early 70s, and we began work on it, and we decided early on that as a firm, Anderson, Barker, Rinker, ABR Partnership, that we needed to respond to the energy crisis of 1973. We decided that we wanted to make this what is now called a sustainable design. The fiscal strains on the firm, when we were constantly asking or wanting to make change, but the state wouldn't financially support this, we decided to split. And Barker, Rinker, and Seacat left, and Ron Mason was an employee of the firm. And so Ron Mason and Alan Gass and I formed a new firm. For lack of a better firm, we called it John Anderson Associates. But the strains of the financial problems, I think on paper we lost something like $200,000 on the project. somehow managed to keep the firm going, but it was touch and go. And Alan left the firm in about 1980, and Kurt became a partner, and it became Anderson Mason Dale. Chuck Sink came in one day and said, "I'd like to talk you into becoming a member of AIA." This was 1960. And he was pretty persuasive, and I put aside the one meeting that I had gone to, which wasn't very impressive, and said yes, I would. And then within a couple of years of joining AIA, well, within about 6 years, 5 years, I was asked to run for secretary. I was the vice president and then became the president in '67. Was the vice president during the convention. My major task was to make sure that the last drunk got on the bus in Central City. We leased the town and had our host chapter party in Central City. To the best of my knowledge, I got the last guy on the bus. I got home about 2 o'clock. Yeah, but it was a fascinating experience, and you know, I look on our second effort, putting on the National Convention in 2001. It's the difference between night and day.
I know.
Yeah.
It's coming back.
The year before 2001, the year 2000, we had put together an organization called AEC Direct, Architects, Engineers, and Contractors Direct, to take over some of the functions of AIA. We created this monster and put it in the hands of some people who had been AIA executives. We had raised about $8 million to put this thing together. And they went through a huge amount of it without really showing good management skills and turning a profit. 5 days after it was inaugurated in December of 2000, the organization went belly up. And we went from a position of about $1.5 million in reserves to a position of $5 million in debt. And so, you know, a lot of what I wanted to do, largely deal with the diversity issue and architectural education, a lot of that simply went by the wayside, and we were in a struggle to survive as an institution. There's some pretty Machiavellian measures that we had to take to tighten up the budget. Things were becoming under control by September 11th, and then it happened. And the rest of the year was spent to a certain degree in response to 9/11. But 10 days after 9/11, I went to New York and we put together a local response, a New York chapter, city chapter response in the form of a fund to help architects who were impacted in New York City by the 9/11 experience. We were fortunate in that I don't think a single member of the Institute was killed in the attacks. But architects were without offices, they were without means of income. There was an international component to this because I was swamped with international letters of support and condolence and concern from all over the world. And when I went to Japan in early October, less than a month after, I remember talking to the people in Japan about when they said, "What can we do?" I said, we have created a fund in New York. It's run by the chapter. You might consider gathering money from around Japan and sending it to that fund. By the time I got back to the United States from Korea, there was a check for $60,000 from the Japan Institute of Architects. You know, that's kind of the highlight of the year when I think about it. Just the fact that internationally we came together because of this terrible tragedy. And the Japanese remembered our response from the Kyoto quake earlier and said, now it's our turn. We want to help. So it was a crazy year. It really was crazy. We set in motion a program that had a goal of being back $2.5 million in the black in reserves by the end of 2003. We reached and exceeded that goal before the end of 2002. Incredible response on the part of the Institute in tightening its belt. I guess one interpretation would be there's an awful lot of fat there if you managed to survive in spite of losing that kind of money. But I was very, very proud of the Institute for the way it recovered from the double shocks of 2001. One of my deepest concerns, and it continues to be there, is the issue of architectural education. I think we are still saddled with a medieval way of training architects in this digital age. Sure, everybody that comes out of school is proficient in the use of the computer, but we are still training architects in a way that I think is unconscionable. We are saddled with a focus on design and design only in architectural education, and we have to get over that. I went to a school where, among other things, when I was at Harvard, one of the classes was construction. I had to show an affidavit from a general contractor that I had spent the summer, 3 months at least, working with tools. By the time I got out of school, I had a solid understanding of how buildings go together. And it was demanded for my getting the degree. I think we've moved away from that. We're talking about theory. We are talking about design, almost to the exclusion of all those other things that constitute real architectural practice. I think we've made great strides with gender equality. I look at my own office now, and it must be 35 to 40% professional women. I look at other statistics relative to Asians, relative to Hispanic and African Americans, and I'm struck by the fact that the African American is way out of it, and yet this is a very significant part of the population that we are supposed to serve. But when I see a female president of the AIA followed 2 years later by an African American, I'm heartened by where we're going.